Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Paul LaChapelle. I'm with Montana State University and incoming president of the International Association for Community Development. And it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this morning's plenary session and to welcome our distinguished panel. I want to talk to you a little bit about the connection that we're going to be talking about between community development and the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. And we have some handouts on your table for those of you that may not be familiar with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Just some key points and a definition, very brief definition of what those 17 goals are. And you're going to be hearing about some of those throughout this morning's presentation. I hope you'll come to realize through the next hour the connection between community development and the Sustainable Development Goals and the role that all of us might be able to play in advancing those goals, and the role for our profession to play as we move forward with this agenda. Each panelist will have 10 minutes to address the following two questions. How are the Sustainable Development Goals important for community development in your sector, in your area, the area that you work? And secondly, what specific programs or practices have you identified or created to apply and measure some or all of the Sustainable Development Goals? We'll start with Anita Paul. She's the director of the Pan-Himalayan Grassroots Development Program based in northern India. Next, we'll hear from Mark Ritchie. He's the former Secretary of State here in Minnesota. And last, we'll hear from Annette Dixon with the World Bank. She's the Vice President for South Asia. There's a detailed bio for each of our panelists in your program and also online. Now, we chose this order for the simple reason of scale, but we recognize there's not a strict definition. Anita working roughly at the grassroots or community level, Mark working more at a state level, and Annette addressing more regional and global issues. We'll, after their presentations, about 9:35, we'll have 20 minutes for question and answer. Cindy Bagné will have a roving microphone, a wireless microphone, and I'll bring that to her. And we look forward to a very robust conversation for 20 minutes, and we'll wrap up at 10 o'clock. So with that, I'm going to load Anita's presentation, and I'll turn it over to Anita.
Good morning, everybody. I'd, to begin with, like to thank CDS and IACD for giving us this opportunity of sharing our experiences dealing with sustainable development goals in a developing nation like India. Kalyan, who's also in the room over here, Kalyan and me set up this non-profit called Grassroots in 1992, and we are based in the Indian Himalayan region, which roughly forms 16% of the geographical area of our country and has roughly 11 states, and we happen to work in something like 4 states. Grassroots aims to engage with the communities in helping them reaching or taking a step forward towards ecological security, because our belief is that ecological security is necessary condition for poverty alleviation. So with that aim in our minds, we set out to work, and the formation of or the declaration of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals along with its associated 169 targets kind of helps community development practitioners like us in it's a framework against which we kind of pitch our work towards. The fact that SDGs have been declared as a holistic in nature with interlinkages is a step forward, and I think step forward from the MDG days, and I think as a global community, we should be able to get our act together. In Grassroots, Over the years, since 1992 to now, we have developed a holistic approach, and by holistic approach, we mean that we have these 4 thematic areas because issues kind of interweave with each other. So we work on water, sanitation, renewable energy, livelihoods, and ecological security. Going towards the SDGs, I'm just following the order as the SDGs have been laid out by the UN. So SDG number 2, which aims at zero poverty. Our initiatives in improving people's livelihoods and moving towards economic security has led to the formation of a community-owned enterprise known as Umang, which is owned and managed by women producers of a river basin where we work in. They are the shareholders, and we have been able to bring some improvements in the quality of life of our shareholders by providing basically, there's a lot of hand-holding. We service the entire value chain from business to customers, emotional support, I think, which is very important when it comes to deal with women as members, and also skill development, leadership skills, and what is important in such an endeavor is the professionals who man these enterprises are also from within the region, because we recognize very well that MBAs, qualified professionals, may not want to come to such grassroots levels and anchor situations like that. Our engagement in all these kind of capacity building, of course, also helps in women taking on wider leadership roles in other development programs that are ongoing in their areas. And grassroots and Umang has been able to play a significant role in them adopting these kind of roles. You know, while we are in the Himalayas and they're called the water towers, it is very, very sad that actually we have a huge water crisis, and water crisis, I'm talking about drinking water and not water for irrigation. So while in a situation like that, because of degradation, when the water recharge has not happened, grassroots has come up with the appropriate technology option in order to improve the quality of life here and now. And we do these wells, and today, it's infiltration wells, and today we have managed to reach 600 communities, over 20,000 households in having access to clean, potable drinking water. What is important and significant in these kind of initiatives is that they are community managed. We do significant capacity building in terms of operation and maintenance, and also it is not a handout. Minimum 10% of the capital costs are borne by the communities concerned. Renewable energy, it's a huge challenge for us. I'm talking about renewable energy for clean domestic energy for cooking, and not about anything else. In our situation, in our river basins, what we are extracting from the forest, even in terms of just keeping a hearth going, is now hurting the health. And in a situation where people's demands outstrips the annual incremental growth in a forest, people like us, what can we do? We cannot say, stop going to the forest. We have to come up with some viable option, and grassroots has found it relevant to introduce biogas as a way forward. Biogas not only provides clean domestic cooking energy, it also burns methane, which is one of the rogue gases linked with the climate change and global warming. It also, of course, reduces biotic pressure, and it also reduces carbon dioxide emissions in the atmosphere. Climate action, everybody, it's the buzzword. It is a challenge which we as a humanity are definitely facing, and mountain communities or any other community who are kind of natural resource based for their survival, they are the most threatened, I believe. So we have started this process of engaging communities and having a dialogue, generating data, kind of plotting the rainfall and river flows and stuff like that, with the idea of getting in some kind of scientific knowledge to understand that, yes, what are the challenges that we are facing, and through these dialogues, we are trying to build resilience and also do some pilots in terms of helping them adapting to the changed circumstances, primarily in the agriculture farming sector. Life on land, ecological security, which is our passion. and our mandate. So finally, we, with partnerships with other global associations, during 1992, mountain ecosystems got its due, and it was recognized as an important and significant ecosystem services that we provide. Grassroots initiates eco-restoration activities, as I had mentioned earlier, and women play a critical role in improving the hydrology of the river basins. We talk about river basins as a unit more than watershed development because we feel that rivers speak better. There is an emotional connect with the communities living on either banks of the rivers. Inter-basin and intra-basin dialogues has helped us in getting the vegetable cover improved, and there are over 1 million saplings that we have planted out, and it's heartening to say that more than 75% survival has been reported through our monitoring initiatives. Partnerships, collaborative partnerships is important, and Grassroots realizes that. We are a lean organization, yet we try to reach the benefits of holistic mountain development by forging links with other civil society like-minded organizations and also through other networks in order to get our voice heard. And more importantly, of late we are trying to develop mechanisms on having technology exchange. Like the biogas that we had talked about earlier, we are forging links with China because they have gone ahead and they have developed a more robust model than what we perhaps have been able to do. I would like to thank you. Paul gave me 10 minutes and I was nervous about exceeding. I think I've managed to do it within this. And as a community development practitioner, I feel honored to be here and to be able to share my experiences, because somebody very rightly said, you know, we didn't inherit this earth from our ancestors. We actually have borrowed it from our children. And this is our little contribution in working towards sustainable development. Thank you.
Anita, thank you for inspiring us, and thank you to the organizers and from all of you who've come to this special place on the planet. I live here. I get to brag about it a little. But also for this opportunity to talk about why these UN goals are so important to us, especially right at this point in history. My work is promoting progressive internationalism. It's not necessarily what you would find in the newspaper advertisements, but that's what I've done with almost all of my life. And in this moment, these development goals are quite important because they bring three key elements from my perspective to my profession, to my life's work. One is hope, second is leadership, and third is the remembrance that love is the most important element of what we do. First, in terms of hope, these goals stand on the shoulders, the broad shoulders of so much work that's gone before us that has brought us to this point. People were organized globally 50 years to bring international human rights and the aspirations of improved ways of being and living into the process of writing the UN Charter in San Francisco in 1945. Contrary to the very, very strong efforts of Britain and Russia to stop human rights from being mentioned, and they worked hard to try to stop them from being mentioned, human rights made it into the preamble in 2 of the 4 places, and it led to a universal declaration that said what we want in our communities and in our lives is a right, and it articulated those in a very dramatic way. And in the process, the UN began to be part of the mechanism for giving us hope and mechanisms of improvement. Moving forward, we had different kinds of conferences and treaty. We had the UN Conference on Human Environment in Stockholm, and a decade later, what we now call the Brundtland Commission. We began to see that the UN played a central role, and it began to evolve into more specific guidelines and standards and benchmarks and objectives, things that we could measure, leading to things like the Ozone Treaty, recognized by Kofi Annan as one of the most, if not the most, successful international agreement, which has protected the ozone layer, and we are now seeing that. So that evolution of progress through the millennial goals and others, we are now standing on those shoulders, and it is a signal that we should recognize as the next step in forward progress. It should give us hope and help bring us into this new era. But it also is leadership in a time where out there in the world, so much cynicism, so much intolerance and hate, and so much throwing up of hands, or this doesn't work, or that doesn't work. Or people say, yes, we protected the ozone, but we've had the hydrofluorocarbons, we've created other problems. Yes, but these goals give us the specifics and the direction to give leadership at a time when people of the planet are looking for leadership. Whether it's on Zika or Ebola or you name it, there's a lack, if that's an okay word, a kind of soft word for where we are in the leadership deficit on the planet, and these help give us guidance and specifics that we need to articulate international progressivism in this planet. But third, these goals stand on interesting and very important shoulders of our growing understanding of the interconnectedness, of the necessity of who we are and how who we are is affected by how everybody else is doing. I live on a street in the middle of Minneapolis. It's a block over from Humboldt, named after, Baron Humboldt from Germany, who articulated 200 years ago about the interconnectedness. People who fought for those human rights talked about the interconnectedness. You couldn't miss it in following those two big world wars we had. The way that our health and medicine and wellness community have given us senses of interconnectedness in global health problems and health challenges, but just how we know that those phrases that are common in almost all of our major religions about our brother's keeper, or in our state, we often quote one of our most important political leaders who we lost tragically in a plane crash, who just said, we all do better when we all do better. These goals help us to remember that love for ourselves and our communities is interconnected with loving and helping in all communities, and we have to keep that tension of local and global together, because love is in fact the motivation of this work. In my daily work, I have the great benefit of being in a community that has paid attention to these goals. Our mayor went out to be part of the UN process. Our local Chamber of Commerce and our local JCs hold seminars and sessions on them. We have pockets of people who hate them. We have a Tea Party apparatus in the state that blogs about what a terrible thing. So, it's not all nirvana here. It's not the Garden of Eden. But in that process, I get the good benefit of having so many colleagues who are also concerned about these questions and help lift up those goals as examples of things that can guide us. For me, in the kind of last phase of my work life and of my career, the thing that we've focused on here in the past year or so has been what can we do that can help really move a global agenda in a time of intolerance and hatred and violent, and I mean violent, assault that's going on in the planet and in our own country. And we've decided that we want to invite the world here in 2023 for an expo, for a World's Fair. And we want to focus it on healing and wellness and well-being, because we believe that there's an element of healing and health and wellness that touches so many of the development goals, whether it's maternal health or clean water or diet or food or access to education, you name it. And in doing so, we take one of the most important elements that we've learned from the Ozone Treaty, from the Millennial Goals, from these goals, which is that when you put a date on something and invite people over to the house, there's a lot of cleaning up that goes on. Now, sometimes you just shove stuff into the closet, right? So, but sometimes somebody says, we have this very, very high on average thing going on here in Minnesota. Top of the nation in education and medical care, blah, blah, blah. But the problem with averages is that they can be used to mask disparities. And so when we look deeper here, with the help of UN and other agencies and the goals and standards, we can then face those disparities And then we can tackle them, and we can measure them, and we can make progress on them because we have called it out. We've said, here's our goal. We've picked a date, 2023, and millennial goals. Everything's got a slightly different date, but the date helps you to know when the in-laws are going to arrive. And in that process, it gives us the opportunity to make goals of the magnitude that we're talking about aspirational, meaning something for us to go for. Inspirational, because by God we can do it. But they also bring us back to remembering why we do this work. Because we care about ourselves, our families, those who are in our circle of friends and community. And we're thinking very deeply about the coming generations. In the Brundtland report, there were some really fundamental things that were lifted up in that our common future. The most important one that gets a lot of conversation is the saying that environment and economic development are one. But in the writing, there also was the recognition that the most important consideration we can make is the intergenerational consideration reflected in the title, Our Common Future. The work that we do is often for today. There's a deadline, there's a meeting, etc. But what we do, the work that we do, inspired and pulled by things like the UN Sustainable Development Goals, is the work of our responsibility of what we just heard. It's not about us, inheriting this. We have done that, and we hopefully honor that. Our real consideration is, what are we leaving for those who we are borrowing it from for now? Hopefully our work here has the elements of love, the remembering of where we've come from and respecting and honoring that, taking good care of today and now, yes, very important, and mostly investing as much as we can, as much as we possibly can, for those future generations. That's where these UN Sustainable Development Goals help me every day in our work to bring a World's Fair here to Minnesota in 2023, and hopefully maybe bring your conference back here at the same time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here today. As you all know, I think the 17 Sustainable Development Goals are the roadmap, or the new roadmap after the Millennium Development Goals, for the international development community and for governments all around the world. And they will be the roadmap for the next 15 years in development. They promote sustainable development in economic, social, and environmental spheres, and they guide the World Bank's support to our client countries. The declaration for the Sustainable Development Goals explicitly states that this agenda hinges on a global partnership, which includes, of course, the country's governments, but also their peoples. And so the major channel for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals includes the local participation in the development process. And this is, of course, through, as you all well know, through community development processes, but also through the decentralization of resources and authorities to local communities. It's a two-part process. Now, I'm preaching here to you all, but of course we understand that the community development process can help in many different ways. It can help in ensuring that communities are active partners and actors in the change process, in identifying local development priorities and the potential beneficiary groups who need to be reached. But it's also, the community development process gives voice and in this case, it gives voice to the poorest, and that's a goal in itself in the Sustainable Development Agenda. Apart from being instrumental to achieving the other SDGs, it is a goal in itself. Now, as I said, the process is hopefully in two parts. It's both a community-driven development, bottom-up process, and it's also a public policy top-down process where resources are decentralized. And if you're interested in the World Bank's thinking about this, I would refer you to a seminal report, the World Development Report on service delivery for the poor, called Making Services Work for the Poor. It was about 10 years ago where we explore this issue. Now, to illustrate what I think is important about achieving these global goals through community-driven development, I want to use two case studies, which are live, real case studies. They, of course, come from our work in South Asia, where I work, and speak to the importance of achieving these goals in the poorest and most fragile countries in the world. Firstly, I want to talk about toilets in India. As we all know, I think access to sanitation is one of the Sustainable Development Goals. It's an unfinished agenda from the Millennium Development Goals. 2.4 billion people in the world lack access to toilets, and 1/3 of them are in India. Now, this is a serious issue in itself. 1 in every 10 deaths in India is linked to poor sanitation and hygiene, and about 38% of children born in India are stunted. Their development is inhibited through poor nutrition. And about half of this is due to poor sanitation and open defecation. It's also a basic dignity and safety issue, most importantly for girls and women, and is a major cause of gender-based violence in many communities around the world where women lack access to toilets. Now, there's been many attempts to solve this problem, and I think the basic shift that is going on is that the lessons learned from previous attempts is that you don't just solve this problem through building infrastructure, the old build and they will use them attitude. This approach of the past has failed to change preferences and behaviours, including at the community level. And we know that if people are actually to change their behaviour, we need to sustain the usage of toilets and sanitation and clean hygiene practices at the level of every village. And it's not until you have a critical mass of people in every village using toilets and following hygienic practices that we see behaviour change. And so the Swachh Bharat mission in India, which means Clean India mission, is trying to promote the changes in behaviour that are needed to sustain this massive shift from open defecation to use of toilets. Now, it does include a massive infrastructure program as well, through not only building toilets, but building waste treatment throughout the country, and particularly in underserved communities. But the program needs to tap into community leaders and empower them to work with their communities to change behaviours and use tools and monitoring to ensure that knowledge is spread and that communities are empowered. There's a photograph in the middle of this previous slide of these ladies who are a part of such an effort. One of these ladies was actually bitten by a snake when she went out to the fields one night. And so she and her fellow community members have decided to try and take this whole effort on in their local community in Bihar, which is one of the poorest states in India. And so without a huge community mobilization effort, this goal of achieving sanitation under the Sustainable Development Goals is not going to be achieved. My second example is about electricity transmission. And it speaks to a massive effort between the countries of Central Asia and South Asia to move renewable energy from hydro generation, existing hydro generation, which has been in place for decades in the poorest countries of Central Asia, the Kyrgyz Republic and Tajikistan, through Afghanistan to Pakistan, which is one of the most energy-starved countries in the world, and also, frankly, is one of the fastest growing countries in the world. Pakistan's population is on track to double in the next 30 years. And this effort has been a 10-year effort to try and get an agreement in place between these four countries, which used to be separated by the borders of the former Soviet Union. That agreement has now been reached. The financing is in place. There are 7 financing partners supporting the 4 countries, and the 4 countries have gone into agreement to move this surplus electricity, which is not needed in the summer months in Central Asia, but which is desperately needed in the summer months in South Asia, in Afghanistan and Pakistan. But this support is not limited to just the infrastructure aspects of building this huge transmission line. As I said, these are the poorest and most fragile countries in the world, amongst the most poorest and most fragile countries in the world. And these communities will be affected by this transmission line. No matter how minimal or how much effort goes into trying to design the transmission line, they will experience some negative effects. But more importantly, they need to have a stake and a benefit from this transmission line. And so the 4 countries have agreed that they will provide community support programs all along the transmission line to ensure that there is benefits for the communities, both through additional access to electricity, but also other economic development activities. And in this way, these communities become stakeholders in this massive transmission project. It will also hopefully ensure that because everybody has a stake in the project, it will help to secure the project even through the most conflict-affected parts of the region. And so I think this is an example of where access to electricity, access to renewable source of electricity needs to actually be supported by a community development process where benefits are shared with all of the communities living along the route through the 4 countries. I don't think, before I finish, we need to just perhaps focus 1 minute on the risks associated with community-driven development, because I think we all appreciate it. It is of itself not risk-free. The development power of communities needs of itself to be inclusive and not captured by interests, and particularly it needs to take account of the needs of minorities. This last weekend, we had a stark and shocking reminder of this in Kabul, Afghanistan, where a group of minority people, the Hazara people, were protesting about actually requesting the government to route another transmission line, a little bit similar to this one, not this CASA project, but another similar project, the so-called Tutak project, and were subject to a huge explosions, and over 80 people passed away. And these were a minority community that were trying to ensure that their needs were addressed in the design of this project. But I think, leaving on a higher note, I think we all understand that there can be no sustainable development without community development. Thank you.
Well, thank you to our panelists. We now have 20 minutes, just about 20 minutes. Cindy does have a wireless microphone. You can just raise your hand.
The economies of the North, the most developed nations, to assist the economies of the South to build economic well-being measures per capita per person, GDP per person. And if you look at what happened between 1987 and now, there has really not been a change in the economies of the South and the disparity between the economies of the North. And now with this set of goals, they're giving us 15 years to do what they didn't do in 30. What is going to need to be done to be dealt with the income inequalities between, the least developed nations and the most developed nations in such a way that we're not creating greater environmental degradation?
For anybody. Here. Good.
Actually, I think the story is a bit more positive than the one that you portray. There actually has been huge progress in poverty reduction in the last 3 or 4 decades in parts of the world. If you just take a country like Bangladesh, for example, it's actually, when it became independent, it was one of the poorest countries in the world. It's had massive progress in poverty reduction. Its human development outcomes have actually overpassed India and many other countries that are actually much richer than it is. Now, that's not to say that there is no poverty in Bangladesh. There's huge challenges, not least to do with the political discourse, the governance, infrastructure, and many other challenges. But on human development outcomes, it's one of the global success stories, and there are many other cases like that around the world. So it's a mixed picture. I think what really worries me is that the concentration of poverty and indeed the Sustainable Development Goal challenges are increasingly concentrated in the most fragile and conflict-prone countries in the world. And that's why I think projects like this transmission line and through these very, very unstable parts of the world are actually really important and is increasingly a focus of my institution and many other global development agencies, unless we can actually help to secure and bring peace and prosperity to these parts of the world, we won't be on track to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals.
Can I just quickly add, the way we view, the way I look at Sustainable Development Goals is actually it's a framework which does help national governments. Somehow the global push towards quality of life push does help in framing policies. I agree with Annette that the MDGs, there was a lot of criticism. There's a lot of criticism who develops these goals, who develops the indicators. It's the global north who develops and south. You could go on and on with it. But the fact of the matter is that MDGs did help in improving maternal mortality, infant mortality, and access to primary education. So, if you look at the positives and work towards it, yes, there are challenges. But the problem with the SDGs right now is we don't have a framework for implementation, let's put it like that. So yeah, I hope that in the next year or two, some more clarity will happen on issues like that.
Thank you. I have a question, I guess, for Annette about the transmission line. Given that some of the risks that you talked about is that it's going through areas that are very fragile, there's security risks around large infrastructure projects, and large infrastructure projects have the risk of elite capture of those benefits. I'm just wondering around why there's been the money put into that rather than small-scale solar, decentralised energy projects, biomass. Some of the things that I've actually had the privilege of seeing Anita and Kalyan have developed, because at that local level it can actually shift some of the power dynamics, leads to long-term benefits, is more sustainable at that local level. And there's always a tension between you need big infrastructure, but in Australia, the US, we're looking at more decentralised energy systems. So Just wondering about that.
Sure. I actually don't see it as an either-or. We support both, and in fact, small-scale solar has been hugely important for bringing electricity to households at the household level. Having said that, and we do support even rooftop solar on a massive scale in large cities as well. So it's not either-or. We've just there's a massive program for rooftop solar in India at the moment, for example, which we're supporting as well. I do think it's actually, both sources are actually really important, and the reason it's important is for private sector development. Unless you can have secure access to electricity, you're really not going to have investment in things which are going to create jobs on the scale that you need in these countries. And so you need both. I think electricity is a huge multiplier of other benefits. At the household level, it's really important for increasing household income, allowing kids access to education. It enables women's work and small-scale entrepreneurship. It reduces population growth. You know, there's huge multiplier benefits, but it's also the large scale when you actually have access to electricity which will actually support private sector investment, which will lead to job creation in areas which have huge numbers of unemployed. Having just one other thing, I think coming back to the first question, I didn't talk about climate change and why your north-south question is actually, I think, at the heart of the climate change debate and the climate change challenge. And I think, you know, in countries which are still developing rapidly, the choices that they make and are supported to make in terms of their energy choices are going to be critical and are critical for the planet. And that's why I think that, you know, solar plays a role, wind plays a role, biomass plays a role, but so too does hydro. And it happens that in the countries of South Asia and Central Asia, the countries that have access to hydro potential are also poor. Countries like, as I said, the Kyrgyz Republic, Tajikistan, Nepal, Bhutan, these are countries that can actually earn export revenues and improve service delivery if they actually generate hydro for export to neighbouring countries. And it helps also to actually those countries to avert further investment in coal, heavy oil, and so on. So it is actually a really important part of the climate change scenario.
Yes, hi. One of the international issues that the World Bank is involved in is in the cultivation of seeds. And so, for example, in countries like India, where farmers have had thousands of years of experience and knowledge in cultivation of seeds, such as basmati rice, for example, they're now subject to patent laws that have nothing to do with their culture or their practice. And they can't compete with companies such as Monsanto. And, you know, I have to say, although I'm not a fan of demonizing anybody, I do get a kick out of hearing Monsanto described in many places as Monsatan. My question is, what can the World Bank do to begin to respect the thousands of years of knowledge and history and practice in the cultivation of seeds?
I live in fear of answering your question because you know way more about this topic than I know. I think obviously everything we support has to be done with local ownership. You know, you don't get development unless there's local ownership. I think that's the point. And our goal is to try and bring international knowledge, best practice, evidence to support the country's development choices that they make. Having said that, I don't know anything about the seed question that you're referring to, but I can find people in the bank who can answer your question.
So in 1994, it was the 50th birthday of the World Bank. And an organization here that I was leading organized a conference up at Bretton Woods to honor all the founders that were still alive. There were about 50 at the time. And Victor Urquidy, who actually just died just a couple years ago, was the representative from Mexico. And he gave a very impassioned speech about the battle that took place, because in the original negotiations, it was the International Bank for Reconstruction, reconstructing Germany, reconstructing Europe. And he was furious that there was no consideration to development. And he told, this was 50 years on, these were older people at that point, some 98 at that point. But anyhow, he still had the passion of somebody who in 1944 was fed up with the world discussing the rebuilding of Germany and ignoring what was going on in Mexico and Argentina and the rest. Uruguay in particular came up. And he described the session where they added "and development" to the International Bank for Reconstruction, and then "and development." So from the beginning, it's complicated, and it has always been a struggle, especially during the McCarthy era in the United States, the Red Scare era, where so many of the finest of the public servants were imprisoned, driven to suicide, thrown out of their jobs. I mean, these institutions went through massive change on top of a difficult birthing. And in that process, it takes a long time to keep the attention of a global institution on the more fundamental things like development. Reconstructing Europe, incredibly important, and the German Marshall Fund was an extension of that thinking. But development, which is what Victor Urquidy brought to that discussion, and he pointed out that these world wars came about because of economic crisis. I mean, he was quite articulate. I think if Victor was here today, he would repeat what he said at that conference, which is that it's a lifelong task to keep the needs of the poorest of the poor in front of the most powerful of the most powerful. And I think it's the work that we must do every day, keeping these things brought forth.
Thank you. It came as a shock to me to know that the British had opposed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights when I thought British lawyers...
Viciously.
I thought British lawyers
They
had helped
thought
craft
that
it.
those colonies would challenge them at the UN.
But quite right.
They were right.
It's good to be criticized. It's good to be criticized, but hey-ho. But Mark, you also mentioned the Tea Party and that sort of ethos of climate change deniers, and a lot of people actually disliking this framework, this whole framework, the UN, and this more structured approach to actually tackling, and joined up approach to tackling the sorts of these issues that affect all of our countries. And also those work at the grassroots, in development work in all countries, not just the global south, but the north as well, have known that this neoliberal agenda that has swept through this wave that's been attached to globalization has also been reflected in the World Bank and the IMF, and which has been linked to things like privatization. There's been a sort of a deal whereby you accept some of these programs on condition that you privatize and withdraw the role of the state. Now, it seems to me that what we're seeing here is an end of that paradigm in a way, a recognition that you need to have a public-private civil society partnership, and that the state at an international level and through state agencies like the World Bank, and at state level here in municipalities, national governments, etc., have to be more interventionist once more. It's almost a social democratic ethos, I think, that we're seeing here, rather than a neoliberal ethos. Or maybe I'm completely wrong. And I'd like to know, because we in the community development world, you need to be funded from somewhere. You're funded either by your municipalities or through foundations and charities and all this sort of. Our ability to help mobilize and support and give technical assistance to communities on the ground requires us to be employed. And I'd like to know, what is the role? What do you see out of this as we go ahead, the role of bodies like the World Bank and state authorities in actually, once again, reinvesting in the employment of grassroots development workers?
Well, I'm imagining that probably every person in the room has a different exact situation that they're in, and so it's kind of a little bit complicated. But I can, I've reflected on this a little bit because I've been, frustrated. I mean, for example, at this conference where we had all the founders of the IMF and the World Bank and what we now call the WTO, the IMF founders said, we created the IMF to stop devaluations of currencies. And then they went on to say, how did it become an agency primarily promoting the Washington Consensus, the devaluation of currency? So the founders were a bit perplexed, and I would say more than perplexed. They were upset that the purpose of the IMF to stabilize currencies had been, subverted through this process of, liberalization and deregulation at a global level. And so even the founders are, thinking about what to do with this. But I do think that at this moment in history, this community as a tribe, broadly defined globally, was pushed out of these important institutions generally, but that gave an opportunity for this tribe to be a somewhat clear-minded and clear visionary about the problems in the bigger thinking, in the Washington Consensus or whatever, and to then lead the articulated criticism of that. And in that articulated criticism, what didn't happen was the coming back together, making those criticisms vulnerable to being taken on by people like Donald Trump and then used for other purposes that were anti-international and hate-based and exclusion-based. So our tribe has some responsibilities for being very good critics and clear-minded with some good ideas about alternatives, but not figuring out how to bring that element back into the political process strong enough that it couldn't be captured. And, Brundtland Report is sort of famous by saying, the sort of economic, social, and environmental, the three-legged stool, that was the thing. But it didn't ever say that we needed to also be paying attention to the democracy or to the political, the economic, social, environmental, and political. And I ended up organizing this conference of the founders of the World Bank and the IMF, the WTO, because people at the GATT in Geneva, the trade organization, pushed back on me really hard and say, okay, you critics, where are your great ideas? Where are your big ideas? You're so critical, where are your ideas? And they said, maybe you should study your history a little bit more. And I said, okay, well, we'll invite in the founders and talk about the history. So somewhere in our work, we've been very, very good about criticizing and knowing what's wrong and having some ideas, but we haven't figured out how to marry that back into this kind of political process that gives us Donald Trump, Brexit, you name it, hatred and violence at an incredible level, at the community level, globally, right here at home, right here a mile away, and halfway around the world in Kabul. So I don't know what our tribe does with our responsibility in the creation of this current moment, but I'm very interested in what we do in the advance